was a great overview and a really nice compliment to Bill's talk about the theory. Next up is Seth Noar, who again you met, and he is an associate professor in the School of Journalism and Mass Communications here at UNC, Chapel Hill, and a member of UNC's Lineberger Comprehensive Cancer Center also. His work addresses health behavior theories, message design, and mass media campaigns, as well as e-health applications. Dr. Noar has been an investigator on several NIH-funded studies testing health communication strategies for health promotion and disease prevention. And he is co-author of 2 books, most recently, E-Health Applications, Promising Strategies for Behavior Change. I encourage you all to check that out. Published by Routledge in 2012. Okay, Jeff.
All right, I think so. You guys hear me? All right, good morning, all. Well, this is a lot of fun to be here this morning, talking about one of my favorite topics. Some of my favorite people are here, so this is great. Hope everyone's having an enjoyable morning here. All right, and the slides advance. That's even better. I'm going to talk to you about efficacy and effectiveness of e-health applications. I'm kind of taking a step back and looking more broadly at the field, which I think will be nice. A lot of the talks today are going to focus, zero in on specific areas. So folks in this room are probably quite familiar with a lot of the trends in the technology area, and this slide nicely shows what pretty much what's happened over the last couple of decades. This is internet adoption in the U.S., which is well over 80% at this time. And many folks, I'm sure many in this room will remember the dial-up days. And so as you can see, the dial-up has gone down over time, and so we don't have to deal with those slow loading images anymore, which many of us remember. And broadband has gone up, so internet access has proliferated and also gotten a whole lot better. And this is the case not only in the U.S., of course, but worldwide. We see trends toward increased access in all kinds of countries and contexts. And cell phones are also one of the most incredible technologies in terms of reach. Cell phones probably have more reach than any technology today. And these are data from the U.S. showing roughly 85% of folks being cell phone owners. Smartphones ownership now is about half of those folks. And worldwide, as we know, cell phones are one of the most technologies that has sort of the greatest reach. In fact, many countries that really couldn't afford to develop the kind of phone networks we developed in the U.S. have just kind of not had to worry about that because they skipped over all that and going right to mobile phones, which require a lot less of that kind of infrastructure. And another last slide here on this, social media and social networking, as we know, has gone up rapidly. And the thing I like about this slide is it breaks it down by age. And we all know that younger populations love social media. I noticed this years ago when I would come outside my office and walk down where all the students at University of Kentucky used to sit. A lot of the undergrads would hang out, and I would just see Facebook on all the computers back when it was just starting, and I wasn't even sure what it was. But this slide shows that you shouldn't be surprised if you see your grandmother on Facebook, because social media use is going up among all populations, including 65 and up. So you heard it here first. I've given you fair warning if you see her on there in the coming weeks, if she's not on already. So one term that's been used to describe the whole emerging field of applying technology to health is e-health. And from what we've seen in the literature, this has been probably the single term that is starting to be used more than any other. And so e-health has been defined as the use of emerging information and communication technology, especially the internet, to improve or enable health and health care. And given the trends I just showed you, it was only a matter of time before us health folks jumped in and tried to figure out how can we use these technologies to improve health and reduce disease. And so the e-health field, as we've already seen this morning, we have all kinds of modalities that we can use: internet, tablets, mobile phones, websites, We have virtual worlds. We have video game technologies, which increasingly allow us to play games without even holding a controller, extra games, all kinds of exciting things. Social media, YouTube. I just had an article that YouTube is changing, is really shaking up the media world in all kinds of ways. And so if we look across this broad field of e-health, we see all kinds of examples of applications and programs. Everything from Text for Baby, a maternal and child health text messaging service. Essentially, it's the first text messaging service that's been brought to scale in the U.S., has tens of thousands of users. The Heart Truth, you may have seen this campaign in various places, one of the first campaigns that really made significant use of social media. Debbie Thompson was supposed to be here this morning, as folks know, and she probably would have talked about Escape from Diab, which is this great nutrition game for children, which has been shown to increase nutrition-related behaviors, fruit and vegetable consumption, things like that, and all kinds of other applications. We also have some nice text messaging programs that have been shown to increase smoking cessation, computer-tailored programs. So we've seen just all kinds of examples across different technologies and across different health behaviors. And so I was interested in this area for a while and did a variety of different projects, particularly in HIV prevention, but also some meta-analyses and things across areas. And so my colleague Nancy Harrington and I put together this book project, a book that we published last year called E-Health Applications, Promising Strategies for Behavior Change. And so some of the things I'll talk about hopefully come from what are hopefully insights from putting this edited book together, looking across mobile, apps, internet-based interventions, computer-tailored interventions, video games, and also getting into issues like dissemination and policy. And so one of the things that we found, it looks like my slide popped over a little there at the top. One of the things we found is that folks have been writing about and talking about all the advantages of e-health. So why e-health? Why is there so much excitement about this field? Why is there so much action going on in it? Well, it's not just because it's cool and we have these fun devices, but the devices offer all kinds of different functions that we didn't have before in many cases. And so interactivity, the ability to put out multimedia, the ability to do credible simulations, automated data collection. The researchers in the room can all appreciate that. As researchers, we love that. We've heard talk about using mobile phones, ecological momentary assessment, and things like that, giving us all kinds of new opportunities to do new research. And in some ways, it's a good thing that our theories are not up to the task, because a lot of our theories need to be improved. We need to develop new theories, and so these technologies give us the opportunity to do that. It won't make me sad at all to see some of our theories go by the wayside and develop new and better theories. I think that was a really great point of Bill's this morning. And so in particular, there's three of these in particular that I think are particularly exciting and that people in the field have been talking about, and that is we have this thing called the Internet, which can give us really broad reach as a delivery system. At the same time, we can individualize content. And so in the past, we had to choose between these, right? We had to choose, we'll use mass media and we can reach everyone, but the content's not going to be individualized. Or, as Deb talked about, we can have these individual counselors that can individualize content and do counseling, but the reach is not going to be what we'd like it to be. And so the real promise of e-health is being able to do both of those things. In addition to that, having developing programs that can give us relatively low cost in terms of delivering. And so this has been talked about as sort of a magic combination of factors that we didn't have previously, but that e-health has the promise to give us. The combination of wide reach, individualized content, which should lead to higher efficacy, and then relatively low cost delivery. So that's a pretty powerful combination. So there's several sort of big questions we can ask about this field, and we try to tackle a lot of these in this book project. So what do we know about efficacy? What do we know about what works in this field? What kinds of programs and with what populations? A second question is one that I find particularly interesting, which is sort of the mechanism question. So when things are effective, why are they effective? And Deb very astutely pointed out that we shouldn't be focusing on the technology, we should be focusing on the function and the attributes of the technology, because those are the things that are likely sort of our mechanisms. And if we can understand the effective mechanisms, then when the technology of the day passes and we have a new technology, we don't have to start from scratch, but we can say, oh, self-monitoring. We know that works. We know how it works. Now we can do it in this newer technology. And so that, from a theoretical perspective, that's really a critical and really interesting question. And then how can we disseminate what works? How can we get it out there, and how can we build maintenance of these things across individual settings and policy? So I thought I would deliver a little bit of a report card to you this morning, and it seemed that an appropriate way to do it might be with Facebook likes. So, so I've given 3 likes to the computer-tailored intervention and internet-based intervention literature, which are sort of computer-tailored interventions are these interventions that assess individuals and then use computer algorithms to deliver personalized and tailored content. One of the arms in Deb's trial that she talked about did that, and there's a really massive literature at this point on those. And those were some of the earliest e-health interventions. Many of the early ones, though, assess people using different modalities, but the delivery would be in a print report. And now a lot of them are delivered online. And so we kind of have a large literature in that area, a fairly large literature. We have several meta-analyses now, and we probably have the largest evidence base for that literature than any other literature in e-health. It doesn't mean we know everything there is to know, that's for sure, but we have good evidence for what works and pretty good evidence about why. Although, as Deb pointed out, there's still lots of exciting questions for us to explore. The second group here are text messaging interventions and health video games. And so this literature is not, these literatures are not as far along, but they're emerging pretty quickly. And now we're starting to see, as I'll show you in a moment here, more evidence about these areas. And so we have a reasonable amount of evidence, but we still have some ways to go. The interesting thing is, and this will, a lot of things I'll say in this talk are going to resonate, I think, nicely with the other talks this morning, social media and apps. And so you might, so you're looking at me going, Seth, what do you mean 1 like? Come on. I mean, what are people talking about nowadays? Social media and apps. Everyone's talking about iOS 7 and all the new functions and new apps. Well, as Bill pointed out, and Deb pointed out too, research is slow, right? Technology moves fast, research moves slow. And so we have very little evidence for what can social media do for us in terms of, for example, health behavior change, and what can apps do for us. And so we have studies underway. We've seen a few studies out there, but they're actually there's very little evidence to date about what those kinds of technologies and the attributes of those technologies can do for us. We can probably learn a lot from text messaging, from internet-based interventions that can inform these things, and that's where the point about let's take the principles of what we know and apply them to the new technology is important, but there's very little literature on these to date, although I highly suspect that's going to be changing shortly, and I'm sure there are studies underway currently in those areas. So to say a few words about some of these, so computer-delivered interventions were some of the earliest e-health interventions. So these were delivered on a computer, often sort of a local computer, so with a CD-ROM. You guys remember those, CD-ROMs? Seem kind of ancient at this point. And we now have evidence across a whole range of health behaviors that these kinds of interventions, which are typically interactive, can be efficacious. And we've seen a variety of meta-analyses looking at that and showing that. Same is true of internet-based interventions. In some cases, the effect sizes are not, wow, blowing us away. But across the literature as a whole, we do see interventions being efficacious in changing a variety of health behaviors, including things like smoking cessation, nutrition behaviors, physical activity, although a little less so in some analyses, and HIV behaviors like safer sex. This year, the first 2 meta-analyses came out on texting interventions. So we now have evidence that text messaging interventions can be efficacious for health behavior change, particularly in smoking cessation is one of the areas that has some of the most evidence in this area, the most studies, and there's some promising findings for things like physical activity and disease management. And so we're just starting to see sort of the first generation of that research come together and show that, yeah, we can, we can develop these interventions and they can work. And health video games is also kind of in that camp of where we have a lot of studies coming together, some showing actual changes in things like nutrition behaviors, as I mentioned with Escape from Diab, the nutrition game, and starting to see reviews pull a lot of this work together. So these literatures are kind of maturing in that way. So one big caveat here, and I think this will resonate to a lot of what Bill talked about, is that pretty much everything I presented so far, it comes from efficacy research. And so Brian Flay, in his classic paper on efficacy and effectiveness, talks about an efficacy trial is designed to evaluate what an intervention achieves under optimum conditions. So think about for a minute what our government could achieve under optimum conditions, and think about what we're achieving today. So, sorry, I couldn't help myself. So efficacy research and these trials that we do are extremely important, but they're showing what happens during optimum conditions. Then we take these things out into the real world, which is what we want to do, and what happens then. So the concept of effectiveness has to do with a program being effective, not efficacious, but effective, only if an efficacious treatment program is developed, implemented in such a way as to be made available to an appropriate target audience in a manner acceptable to them. And by acceptable, we're talking about things like folks being receptive to the program, participating in it, complying with it, adhering with it. And so it's a whole different ball of wax from efficacy. And so really the vast majority of the evidence that we have today in e-health is on efficacy, and that's an important first step. But as you'll see here, I'm going to make this point that we're really lacking in effectiveness data. And so we kind of have, and we've seen this movie before, right? If we build these things and they work, people are going to come out of the woodwork to get them. And unfortunately, that hasn't really been the case in the past. And so this is an area that I think is going to be really critical moving forward to understand not only can we build these things and they can work, as Deb pointed out, we can build these things and they can be efficacious, but how can we actually get them out there in a way that they'll really have impact and that people will use them and benefit from them. And so we see these kinds of analyses by dissemination and implementation people showing us that, number one, the vast majority of efficacious interventions never really affect people outside of the research trials themselves, and number two, the ones that do go on a 17-year odyssey, which does not sound promising. And so what happens here is as you trickle down this funnel, you lose things along the way, and very few of our research-tested interventions make it into practice. And so it's no surprise that we've seen this rapid emergence of this dissemination and implementation field, which is studying how do things get disseminated, diffused, how do people, settings, organizations adopt interventions, and how can we make that happen so we don't develop these great interventions that just sit on the shelf after the trial's over or after the technology changes and we can't use it anymore. So I don't want to. So if that made you a little bit sad, I'll try to pop some optimism into here, and that is that the good news is there's demand for these things, right? So some people may have seen this headline: the App Store tops 40 billion downloads of apps, and not only that, but in 2012, half of those were downloaded in 2012, which is just incredible to me. In 2012, there were 20 billion downloads of apps. This is just from the Apple App Store. And there are different categories in the App Store, and health and fitness and medical apps are quite popular categories. And I was searching for this, trying to figure out, what some of the download rates are and things like that, and these appear to be some of the most popular apps that have been downloaded. And Deb's probably not surprised by this. The three that I could find that appeared to be most popular were all weight loss apps. And so Calorie Counter and Diet Tracker, Lose It Weight Loss Program, and actually Weight Watchers. And so, there is a market for this stuff. So on the one hand, we're developing these things that are efficacious, and we want to get them out there. On the other hand, we have folks out there that are looking for things that work. We have, lots of folks who want to quit smoking. There was a study that just came out showing that essentially at any given point in time, something like 1/3 of smokers are trying to quit. And obviously there's huge demand for weight loss applications. And so there is demand. That's the good part. And we have to match supply of evidence-based interventions with demand of folks who want to use them. That can be more challenging than we might think. So I put together this little 2x2 matrix to kind of give a sort of take on where I think things are at the moment in this area. And so if you look at the upper right quadrant, is sort of, well, this 2x2 is sort of evidence for e-health interventions as well as availability. And so you've got low and high evidence and low and high availability. And so the upper right quadrant is sort of would be my take on sort of where the real world is now. And so that would be there's a lot of programs out there in terms of high availability, but there's low evidence. And so you can take out your iPhone right now and insert Android and search for smoke cessation, and you'll have loads of apps that come up. The problem is there's virtually no evidence that any of those are efficacious. And as Bill pointed out, Lori and Abrams' review shows that most of them don't even adhere to sort of basic evidence-based principles. So we actually have high availability of e-health right now. It's just most of it is likely ineffective. On the other hand, research is sort of in this bottom left-hand quadrant where the availability of a lot of these interventions that I just talked about, from all these meta-analyses, most of them are not available publicly, and yet we have good evidence that a lot of them can work. And so the sweet spot where we want to be is the bottom left quadrant, right? We want to have applications that have high efficacy or at least some reasonable evidence of efficacy, and we want to be able to make them available to people. Another kind of piece in this puzzle is a review that Rabbit and Glasgow did in our e-health book, actually, and they did a systematic review of e-health intervention research, and they basically found exactly what I'm sort of pointing out today, which is that the vast majority of the e-health field, in terms of the published literature, they found 92% was all efficacy research. Only 8% of studies were not efficacy studies, and very, very few of those, fewer than 1%, were focused on scale-up dissemination of interventions. And so we clearly need a lot more work trying to understand how do we get these things out there once we find that they are efficacious. And so a few thoughts on questions, and then I'll wrap up here before my time runs out. So are our e-health programs truly serving our target audiences? Are they acceptable? Are they useful to target audiences? I know that on my iPhone I probably have 50 apps, and there's only about 3 that I actually use, the ones that I find very useful, and the other ones just kind of sit there. And are they fun, particularly for interventions with children? And Tom Baranowski and Debbie Thompson, of course, Debbie was supposed to be here this morning, and they talk about this a lot in terms of these things can be fun. How can we make them fun, particularly for children and adolescents, for example? Another question is sort of how do people integrate these programs into their everyday lives? How does that work, and how can we better encourage that? Number 3, what are the optimal delivery and dissemination systems for e-health? And so, as I mentioned sort of toward the beginning of the talk, in theory, e-health applications interventions are some of the most disseminable products. But in practice, it's not really happening. And in fact, the CDC has their DEBI program where they diffuse effective behavioral interventions, and they've had a lot of people asking about, well, what about e-health? What about these technology-based interventions? And they've been trying to tackle that and having real trouble of how do we actually disseminate these things? How do we make them available? How do we get them out? And thus far, they have not disseminated a single online or e-health HIV prevention intervention, and they're currently trying to tackle that, but so far they have not been successful in disseminating any of them. So in theory, there's this huge potential here. In practice, we're not quite there yet. Okay, so taking the risk that you'll think I only did this talk to give a plug to the e-health book that we did, I'm going to end with a concluding quote. So Vic Strecker is a professor who was at UNC for many years in public health, and then sadly left this place for Michigan and became a real big name in computer tailoring and e-health. And he was kind enough to write the foreword for our book. And he also kind of makes this point probably better than I ever could. And since no one ever reads the preface for books, I thought I would read it to you. And so what Vic wrote in our foreword, which I just love, is he writes, "This book also addresses the dissemination of e-health. While dissemination is perhaps not as sexy as other chapter topics, allow me to put this as subtly as I can. Chances are that your new killer app will fail. It won't fail because the app wasn't killer. It will fail because you didn't bother to read the chapters related to policy and dissemination. Dude, dudette." That's female for dude. Check Wikipedia. Read those chapters. Thank you.
Yeah, you guys take a seat over there. This one? So we can, we've got about 15 minutes or 12 minutes for questions. Questions for Deb or Seth or both?
And if Polly is out there, we should also have, I think, 2 handheld mics. Oh, you all have your body mics, so I guess you can share that until she comes down.
Okay. So, next. Okay, so the question's from a very young-looking grandmother, and and she's asking how important is it for the users to be comfortable with the technology?
So there was a lot of concern about that early on, and even though we have a new study with 18 to 35-year-olds, most of my work is with middle-aged adults. So the average age of the participant is between 40 and 50, and we've actually looked at, there was a theory, I think, that older adults couldn't really use technology interventions, and across the literature that has not proven to be true. We've even done studies where, in order to satisfy reviewers, we've provided technology to people that never had any laptop or internet connection so that we wouldn't be discriminatory to make sure that anyone could participate. And it does take a little bit of training, but we haven't found that that it's a huge barrier, and that if you can provide sort of instructions and other things like that, that it's certainly becoming less of a concern, but even among certain populations that may not have had a lot of experience, that those things are overcomeable.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. We developed a computer-tailored safer sex intervention for low-income African Americans at an STD clinic, and some of the reviewer concerns early on were some of those same kinds of concerns, and it was really amazing because we kind of found the opposite. We found that since I'm on my desktop computer every day and have at work and at home, and this population not as much. But we actually found it to be a positive thing because the technology was more novel to them, it was more interesting, and in some ways it worked to our advantage because we had to we didn't have to work perhaps quite as hard to sort of wow them. And so yeah, we found it to kind of work in our favor and to not be an issue.
Other questions? Yes. You. Sorry, I'm having trouble seeing all the way.
That's really interesting, and there may be research out there on how people select these things, but if there is, I'm not familiar with it. That's a really interesting question. How do people select among these different, health apps out there? What do they look at? Do they look at reviews? Do they look at ratings? Things like that. So that's one interesting piece of it. And then I don't know. I think we need a good housekeeping seal of approval. We may need some kind of system where apps that meet some kind of test could be given some sort of evidence-based approval and help people to sort through it that way. Just one idea off the top of my head.
It depends on the field, but there are just emerging a few where while the app itself may not have been evaluated in a trial, researchers are looking at components of the app and sort of deconstructing what's in the app and kind of evaluating the either evidence-based componentry that's there or sort of what from theory might be available, sort of what's there, and then kind of rating apps that way. And you can find those in regular published journal reports. But it's hard to keep up because, they're usually dated by the time they get published. So we don't have a system other than that at the moment.
Yes, the gentleman here who has a question.
Oh, good. I thought you were going to talk about my research. Thank you, Shelley. Of course it does. Of course it does. I didn't say the end. I just said the beginning. Yeah. Yeah. I think that's a great point, and so that's my, purist hat on, trying to say that I'm doing this exploration of my own data, but you can make of it what you will, because I want you to be sure that you recognize it's not randomized, et cetera. But great point that we don't necessarily need to. I think one of the things that people are moving toward is trying to take studies that have been done, and if we can, I think Bill mentioned this, break them down and analyze them based on the techniques. Susan Mickey from the UK is just driving this way forward in our field, and there's going to be some application to the technology field. But then, across a broader literature, we may be able to have some post hoc analyses from groups of interventions. Because, in intervention research, one of our problems is it takes us a long time, and we often don't have a lot of participants because it's so costly to have a lot of those participants. So our ability to do a lot of post hoc analyses for what works for which individual is often limited by power within those trials. But if we could somehow combine diverse interventions using this type of approach and then pool that data and try to look for some of these differences, we might be able to advance without necessarily doing the trial. And I think then maybe looking at our ability to do some other type of research design to sort of confirm some of those exploratory findings. But I think it's a challenge, but I think that's one of the ways that at least the behavioral field is trying to kind of push our interventions to make more of them than just the final results of the randomization.
Deb, I would just follow up to that. I think one piece of that, and I'd be interested what you think, is it then becomes increasingly important in the way that we report our behavioral interventions and the extent to which we describe all the components very clearly so that then those kinds of post hoc analyses can be done in an accurate way.
That's a great point, and in fact, the train is already out of the station, and so there are a lot of coding of trials, and unfortunately, those of us who publish in medical journals know that the restrictions on the description of the intervention are often great, and so you don't have a lot of detail about what the intervention actually was. But there is a lot of that post hoc coding that's being done by outside coders, so if we can do a better job of at least publishing additional papers that describe more specifically. I have heard from Susan Mickey that there's a push to editors of journals that in order to publish intervention studies, they're going to potentially have us put our protocol manuals online. And so that train is also moving forward to try to get more transparency of what's in the black box of the intervention so that people can better understand, how to make sense of what the findings were.
I'll just say quickly on the, just building out, because Bill talked a lot about theory-based versus non-theory-based interventions. I think this work that folks are talking about is really exciting because that's such a crude, we've looked at that in a lot of meta-analyses and things, but it's very crude looking at just, did they use theory or did they not use theory, this dichotomous, and there's all kinds of limitations to it. So this idea of what what mechanisms were used, what behavior change strategies, how does that affect the efficacy of the interventions, I think is a much better way to do it, and it's nice to see things move in that direction.
Okay, I'm going to take advantage of my position up here and ask a question, which may be more for Seth, but sort of along the lines that Deb was talking about and the elegant work that she's done. How far have things come in terms of looking at text messaging, at the different aspects of it, what works and what doesn't, or what works better and what doesn't? Are we at the point now where we know anything about that, or is it just mostly we know that it works and now we need to do more studies to understand what works better than not?
Good question. Perfect timing. We just published a meta-analysis on text messaging, and I shared it with a colleague who does a lot of text messaging. She was like, "Oh, this is great. You guys tried to look at what might some of these mechanisms be." And so a couple of things that we found that I think were most interesting had to do with the suggestion that some people might say, "Oh, this is a no-brainer," but we don't know till we look, that text messaging programs that did some type of tailoring, personalization, were clearly more efficacious than those that did not. In fact, the ones that appeared to have the lowest efficacy were those that essentially did more or less a one-size-fits-all set of messages, as opposed to assessing people on different characteristics and using those characteristics, whether it's tailoring, where you're tailoring content. We also look separately at personalization, when you're using people's name or you're personalizing on other characteristics. That also showed efficacy. And we also found evidence that programs that used this, that sent messages at a fixed schedule, just the same throughout the whole intervention, had lower efficacy than those that adjusted their frequency of messaging. And so a lot of it may just come back to sort of the relevance of the program and really building the program to be relevant to not only where people are at in terms of content and personalization, but also in terms of message frequency, in terms of if people are starting to change, maybe they need less messaging or maybe they need more messaging. And some of these, in text messaging, it seems like a simple technology, but there's so many things that can be done in terms of texting, collecting data using texting, with these smoking programs, sometimes have been craving, they can text crave and get a particular message. So I think that, and again, that's I think an exciting part moving forward is how do we best use these technologies and what are the active components of them.
Thank you.
I mean, I can, but we can move on.
Okay. I think we have time for one last question. This person in the back here? In the middle? Yes. So did everybody hear? The question was about the use of game apps and how they're developed and who they use to develop them.
So I'll just say that I think we know less about game apps, but we do know a little bit about Games for Health thanks to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funding 2 rounds of Games for Health research. And you can go to their website and look at the whole variety across a host of behaviors and publications that have sort of come from that. And, again, I think the teams have varied. So some are not very multidisciplinary or collaborative with industry, and others have been more so, recognizing that, and I think if Deb Thompson had been here, which she was telling me a little bit about her talk and her plans, were that they've also learned that it's not just the game developer, but it's the target audience being involved in the game development that has made a crucial difference in the success or not so much of the games that they've developed, and not necessarily speaking of game apps, but that's what we know so far.
Yeah, one thing I'll say is that I divided those out by sort of the big literatures that are out there, but I couldn't agree more with Deb that increasingly these things are coming together, and it's not going to be internet-based over here and texting over there, but they're kind of coming together in different ways, and people are using multiple modalities. It's not as simple as before. But yeah, I don't think we know that much about game apps specifically. I think it's a pretty compelling area, but we are learning more about games, which could be applied there.
I think there's a bit of movement in this gamification of especially a lot of monitoring devices that are out there too that are sort of starting to come, but I wouldn't really put them in the same category as sort of the top popular game app downloads. But I think that when people have looked at being able to maybe use regular games, there's sort of another side of this, which is how can games that people like to do be used to reinforce behaviors that might improve their health? And so there's also sort of do we create a game specifically or an app game specifically for health, or do we think about using that reinforcing or that rewarding aspect of some other type of game to promote behaviors within some like larger sort of program? And so there's a whole nother kind of movement in that area, and people saying, look, these sort of health-related games have a hard competition against sort of the tremendously reinforcing value of other types of games. So let's use what people like to do to encourage them to change behaviors that we want them to do.
Okay, great. Thank you very much to both our plenary speakers. And we're going to move on to the next session.